What is going on, movie freaks? James Hancock here. I'm back with a 100th anniversary video for my top 10 favorite movies of 1925. And yes, you heard me correctly, 1925, not 2025. My top 10 video for 2025 is going to come a little later. But when it comes to 1925 in the silent era, I've always been a massive fan of that period. However, I tend to fall into this trap where I just keep rewatching my same favorite silent movies over and over and over again, like The Gold Rush, which, quick spoiler alert, is my number one favorite of 1925. If you were to take all the movies of 2025 and put them in one basket and The Gold Rush in another basket and say one of them has to be set on fire, which one are you going to choose? Well, then my choice would be clear. But earlier this year when I first got the idea for this video, check to see how many movies from 1925 I had already seen, and I think I'd already seen about 8 or 9 at that point. I was like, all right, well, we'll tackle a few blind spots and then we'll be ready, or be justified in doing a top 10 video. But as is always the case when I get the idea for these top 10 videos, the research rapidly spiraled totally out of control, and now I've seen like I think 31 or 32 movies from 1925, so I'm feeling fully prepared for a legitimate top 10 list, as well as plenty of honorable mentions. And this is definitely a strange topic for me because when I first got into movies, I first kind of went movie crazy, 100-year-old movies didn't even exist yet, but now I've gotten old enough where if you go 100 years back in history, you land smack dab right in the middle of one of the juiciest, most fertile, most creative periods in all of film history. And nothing gets me more fired up for a particular topic than when I get to make a lot of fresh discoveries, especially when those fresh discoveries are by some of my all-time favorite directors where I still had a ton of blind spots from this period. Now, I fully recognize that this topic can be a bit of a tough sell for some movie fans. I was out to dinner with some fellow film enthusiasts like a week or so ago, and I brought up this topic, and one person, a really good filmmaker, asked in total earnestness, how many people do you expect to watch this video? I was like, well, I'm going to watch it, and everybody else is invited along for the ride. But if I want to watch a video, then that's enough for me to get to work on making it. And another thing to consider is that if you have a YouTube channel devoted to film commentary, do you want to chase the trends and talk about the exact same topics that everybody else is talking about? Or do you want to do something that might be quite different from anything else you might find by being made by the other channels? So I think it's safe to say nobody else is going to be doing a top 10 list for 1925 in 2025 this year. But I totally understand that there's some younger movie lovers out there who limit their consumption to more contemporary work. But for me, I've always been the exact opposite. Even when I was young, ever since college, I've always looked up to the filmmakers of the past as being more grandiose, almost like the gods of Mount Olympus, whereas the filmmakers from my own era, I look at them as like mere mortals. But if you set aside my own obvious personal bias, let me put it this way. In the 1920s, it was an era of unrestrained imagination, of incredible artistic and commercial success, and for a lucky few, complete and total decadence, which is captured beautifully in Kenneth Anger's book, Hollywood Babylon. And I've read this book a couple times. I'm not entirely sure that a single word in the book is true. However, if you just want to read scandalous, oftentimes just like mortifying tales about some of your filmmaking heroes from the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, this book will absolutely get it done. It's nothing but murder and sex and drug abuse and artistic triumphs and biblical level failures. It's just an absolutely fascinating read. I'm just not entirely convinced that it's not a total work of fiction. In any case, that book played a large role with my fascination with the films of this period. But in all seriousness, this is a period where filmmakers appeared to be reinventing the art form and reaching for new levels of artistic greatness with each passing year. It was this period of boundless innovation and creativity where you had thriving film cultures emerging all across the globe, and I've done my best to throw out as wide a net as possible when it comes to the films on this list, which includes some fresh discoveries from countries like Japan and Italy. And in my opinion, you don't have to be some diehard film historian or some out-of-touch academic in order to appreciate really good silent movies. Decades ago, as a little experiment, when some of my younger siblings were just toddlers, I would play them Charlie Chaplin films from the 19-teens, the Mutual films, movies like The Rink and things like that. And they would just laugh uproariously. They would just laugh themselves silly, and they had absolutely no problem getting on the wavelength of those early short films. So it's ironic that as we get older and become more sophisticated, oftentimes we lose touch with that open-mindedness to early silent films. And along those lines, I was listening to a podcast with Quentin Tarantino where he was talking about a screening of The Gold Rush at the New Beverly in Los Angeles, and all these little kids had been brought along by their parents, but strangely enough, it was all like the hipsters in their late teens and early 20s who didn't get the movie, but all the little kids that had been brought along were laughing uproariously, having a great time. And so oftentimes when I hear really young people talking about how they can't get into really old movies, I just want to tell them, you know what, maybe the problem is you, not the movies. But one of the many interesting details from this period is how by 1925, we start to see the first generation of early film pioneers already starting to fade into obscurity and retirement, while their successors were living it up, enjoying the peak of the silent era. It was the Jazz Age, it was the Roaring '20s, and the movies just kept getting better and better and better. It's incredible how the whole world went from having no movies in their lives to being completely movie crazy in the span of a few decades. And the film giants of this period oftentimes were some of the highest paid people in the world, but little did these titans of this era know that the reigning champions like Erich von Stroheim and some of the other people from his generation were about to be dethroned by a new generation of fresh-faced newcomers like Alfred Hitchcock or Jean Renoir or Joseph von Sternberg, who were just embarking upon their own legendary careers and were preparing to take over the film industry because, keep in mind, only a few years later, the industry would be rocked to the core of its foundation by the arrival of sound, the most disruptive innovation yet. And some filmmakers out there would manage to adapt and grow, while many would crash and burn. But just to give you a snapshot of some of the giants in action at this time, both young and old, 1925 gave us movies by Charlie Chaplin, Sergei Eisenstein, F.W. Murnau, Buster Keaton, Todd Browning, Erich von Stroheim, Ernst Lubitsch, Alfred Hitchcock, D.W. Griffith, King Vidor, G.W. Pabst, Joseph von Sternberg, Oscar Michaud, Jean Renoir, René Clair, John Ford, who had 4 feature films that year, Carl Theodor Dreyer, Roland West, and Kenji Mitsuguchi. And if you don't recognize some of those names, the good news is you still have tons of good movies out there to look forward to. But sadly, in 1925, there was no release by Fritz Lang nor Abel Gance, but I think we can safely say this brew is rich enough as it is. There's so many good movies and so many good contenders from 1925 that even John Ford, one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, he doesn't have a single movie in my top 10 list, in spite of releasing 4 movies in 1925. But before we dive into my honorable mentions, let me offer a few quick notes just for context. So let's start with the most obvious bit of context. The more things change, the more they stayed the same, because there are a ton of parallels between 1925 and 2025. Like the big one is skyrocketing movie budgets. A lot of these movies, the budgets were completely, totally, ridiculously all out of proportion relative to their commercial prospects, because you had all these mad geniuses reaching for the stars, and sometimes they would crash back down to earth with big giant flops on their hands. But it's incredible looking at the the film slate in terms of like the genres being offered and comparing them to 2025, because there are some similarities. Like in 1925 they had The Lost World, whereas in 2025 we had the latest version of Jurassic Park. In 1925 we had an early version of The Wizard of Oz, and in 2025 we had Wicked for Good. So you start to think to yourself, wait a second, like, have we made any progress in the last 100 years? Have we been going backwards? Or let's say you like superheroes. Zorro for me is more of a pulp hero, or more of like a swashbuckling adventurer. But if you want to call Zorro a superhero because he wears a mask, you have Don Q, Son of Zorro. Or if you like horror movies, the legendary Lon Chaney was incredibly active at this time with movies like The Monster or The Unholy 3 or The Phantom of the Opera. But if you're looking for what's missing from 2025 versus 1925, 1925 had a lot more historical epics, a lot more comedies, and a lot more westerns. And I feel like all 3 of those genres deserve to make a comeback in the modern era. But another parallel with 2025 is how in 1925, the medium was always changing. There are always technological innovations that some filmmakers were using successfully, some unsuccessfully. Obviously, there were some early experimentations with color, but the big one obviously was when would sound arrive and how would it be employed? And some of these movies would subsequently be re-released during the sound era with a little introduction or a little narration added to them. Like The Gold Rush famously has 2 different versions, and the big debate amongst Charlie Chaplin fans is, do you prefer the re-release with him doing the voiceover narration, or do you prefer the original cut? But to be continued on that when we get to number 1. But there's a Western here, the first Western that I ever saw with William S. Hart, thanks to the recommendation from a friend, David Lambert. That also was re-released during the sound era, where you had the original silent film, but it featured an intro with William Hart describing his love and affection for the movie.
The story of Tumbleweeds marks one of the greatest epochs of our American history.
But because film, especially old film, is a very fragile, finite, oftentimes flammable medium, more or less like 80% of all silent films have been lost, or a lot of the silent films that have been preserved in subpar quality. And I feel like a lot of times your experience watching a classic silent movie can be dictated by or influenced by the quality of the print. But that should be abundantly clear to anybody. But if you can find a beautiful, pristine transfer of a really clean print, that's going to have a huge impact on your enjoyment of the movie versus one that's like missing reels or covered in scratches or whatever the case might be. Although I have seen some prints, the film form here in New York, that were covered in scratches where like the texture almost became part of the experience, but there they have really good projectionists who are constantly kind of, trying to give you the best experience possible even if the print or the reels might be subpar. But my last note goes out to any young people out there who might be more than unusually sensitive to out of fashion or out of date depictions of race, even when those depictions are made by black directors. Oscar Micheaux made a really good movie in 1925 called Body and Soul, and when I was watching it, I was like, oh my goodness, like I could not believe some of the lines of dialogue that were spelled phonetically in the title cards. And once again, this is by a black filmmaker. He was like the Steven Spielberg of African American cinema in the first half of the 20th century. But I think I can feel safe in assuming that anybody who's curious about 100-year-old movies will probably have the wisdom and the maturity and the sense of perspective to be able to handle a few depictions of race that will seem out of fashion in 2025. And because I made a pronounced effort to include all of international cinema on this list, we can just sit back and enjoy the ride as we appreciate a variety of out-of-date perspectives from 1925 from across the globe. But let's dive into some of the movies that I did not see for this list before getting into my honorable mentions. Jean Cocteau had a film this year that apparently is a lost movie, but I don't pronounce French, but Fait du Cinéma, but Jean Cocteau would later on do a variety of incredible movies like Blood of a Poet or Fait, but sadly that film is hard to find. But Clarence Brown had two movies, The Goose Woman and Smoldering Fires. E.A. DuPont had a movie called Variete, which apparently is really, really good. Henry King's adaptation of Stella Dallas was a huge hit, was a top 10 hit for the year. There was a new adaptation of She, which had already been adapted 5 times prior to 1925, but in 1925 we got another copy. I really struggled finding a decent copy, which is why I didn't see it. Frank Borzage had a film called Lazy Bones. Leo McCarey has a 20-minute short called Isn't Life Terrible, but Leo McCarey in the 30s would make a lot of great comedies like Duck Soup. What else is there? René Clair had The Phantom of Moulin Rouge as well as Imaginary Voyage. And Julien Duvivier had The Redhead as well as The Abbot Constantine. And apparently Kenji Mitsuguchi, the great Japanese master, he had no fewer than 11 movies in 1925, but some historians say 30, but pretty much all of them have been lost. The only one I could find was a movie called Song of Home, which apparently is his oldest surviving film, but the transfer clearly came from some like really shitty VHS cassette from like the 1980s, so I took a pass, but maybe hopefully one day I'll get a chance to see a good pristine copy of Song of Home by the great Kenji Mitsuguchi. But if you're familiar with some of his later movies, he would make movies like Ugetsu, which is one of the best Japanese ghost stories ever made. But I'm going to show you a quick snapshot of the top 10 highest grossing movies in 1925, just so you can get an idea of what was popular in 1925. But we got historical epics, and we have comedies, and we have horror movies, and we have swashbuckling adventures, and we have dinosaur movies. The variety is fantastic. But an important thing to keep in mind when watching this video is that I might be a bit of an unreliable commentator, because some of these movies I saw recently over the last few months, and they're very fresh in my mind, and some of them I've not seen in decades, like Strike by Sergei Eisenstein. I saw it in a class in college back in like 97 or 98. I have almost no memory of Strike apart from some dizzying montage and some fantastic editing, but I have much clearer memories of Battleship Potemkin. But in any case, if I say a movie is number 6 versus number 5 or the reverse, don't take it too seriously, because sometimes there might be decades in between watching one versus the other. I'm just trying to make as many people aware of these movies as humanly possible. But now it's time to get into my honorable mentions, and I'm going to try to make a genuine, sincere effort to call attention to the ones that I enjoyed, not just the ones that I saw, because it does take an effort to find these 100-year-old movies and to find a copy of the movie that's worth watching and sitting through it. Obviously, some of these movies are more challenging to watch than others, but so I don't want to just spend this entire honorable mention section patting myself on the back for watching these old movies, but here are some of the ones that jumped out at me. Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride, 20-minute short starring Stan Laurel. It's a parody of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but pretty much the only evil thing that Stan Laurel does in it is like steal ice cream and shoot spitballs and things like that. But I also managed to see what might be the directorial debut of the great Jean Renoir, a movie called The Whirlpool of Fate. Back then, Jean Renoir, he basically would take his father's paintings down from the wall, sell them, and make short films or feature films. And in the 30s and 40s and 50s, he would go on to become one of the world's great directors, making movies like The Grand Illusion and The Rules of the Game. But if you want to see some of his early experimental movies, The Whirlpool of Fate, it's definitely worth a look. But I mentioned earlier how 1925 gave us yet another interpretation of The Wizard of Oz, and this interpretation is quite different from the one that would be released in 1939, where it's got this interesting framing device where you have this little girl asking to be read the story of The Wizard of Oz, but what follows, you're like, wait a second, Like, what is the official version? At some point, I'm just gonna need to read the book by L. Frank Baum, because I see all these movies and I never quite know what's accurate or what's not. But a lot of it just feels like a Fatty Arbuckle comedy. But you get all sorts of weird gags with like people being chased through the sky with like lightning shooting them in the butt. But there are no witches, there are no munchkins. And when you finally meet the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, and the Cowardly Lion, they're just disguises. But one thing it does have, like a lot of movies in the 1920s, is insane stunts. And there's an insane plane stunt toward the end of the movie. But moving on, John Ford made 4 films this year, only one of which I've seen. But one of the movies, The Fighting Heart, apparently is a lost movie. But I did manage to get my hands on Kentucky Pride, which is actually in great shape. But the movie is narrated by a horse with title cards. So it's basically like Mr. Ed, but for the 1920s. But if you're a fan of some of John Ford's other films from this period, like Three Bad Men, J. Farrell McDonald is in the movie. But basically the story is from the point of view of a horse who wants nothing more than to make his owner fabulously wealthy by winning a lot of races, but the horse ends up breaking a leg near the finish line of a race, and then it goes into like the next generation of horses and that sort of thing. But if you're a fan of horses and a fan of John Ford, definitely check out Kentucky Pride. But next up, we have one of the major honorable mentions where we have the directorial debut of one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, Joseph von Sternberg. He was 30 years old at the time, and he invested $5,000 of his own money into making this little independent movie. Even in the 1920s, people were making independent movies, and while initially people were kind of bewildered by the movie, somehow a copy of the movie managed to make it into the private screening room of Charlie Chaplin, where it received a private screening for Douglas Fairbanks Sr., Mary Pickford, and Joseph Schenck. But what's incredible is how 100 years later, the movie is so sad, it's kind of tough to watch. You basically have 3 people who join forces trying to find ways to survive together: a little boy, a man, and a woman. And the woman is played by Georgia Hale, who people will recognize from the Gold Rush. But yeah, but just watching a little boy constantly imploring adults like, I'm hungry. It's like, it's tough to sit through. But the movie made a huge impression, and it led to Joseph von Sternberg diving into one of the most fascinating careers of the late 20s and early 30s, making movies like Underworld or The Last Command or The Docks of New York. And of course, he'd eventually team up with Marlene Dietrich, with whom he made like The Blue Angel and Blonde Venus and Scarlet Empress. And I've got a lot of those collaborations right here. But if you're interested in Joseph von Sternberg, his autobiography, Fun in a Chinese Laundry, might be the most arrogant autobiography ever written, but if you love and admire his movies, his arrogance is kind of charming in an interesting way. But this incredible career, it all goes back to 1925, where he made his debut with the Salvation Hunters. But we're just going to press on ahead because I still have a ton of honorable mentions to get to, and haven't even gotten to my top 10 yet, but we also have Master of the House from Carl Theodor Dreyer. And I tackled this on my podcast, Wrong Reel, years ago. I actually did 2 episodes devoted to Carl Theodor Dreyer, but he made movies like Vampire and Day of Wrath and Ordette and The Passion of Joan of Arc. He made so many colossal movies. I wouldn't put Master of the House quite at the level of some of his better movies, but if you're fascinated by his career, and he's one of the best Danish directors ever to do it, Master of the House is definitely worth seeing. If you prefer comedy, check out The Movies, directed by Fatty Arbuckle. He directed short movies in 1925 because after a very public scandal, he wasn't acting anymore. But it's a funny short about a young man going to the big city, and he's warned by his parents not to go anywhere near the movies. However, this young man happens to be a doppelganger for an actor working in Hollywood, and he gets recruited to be his body double due to an injury. But in this year, we had not 1 but 2 movies from director Ernst Lubitsch, one of which is called Kiss Me Again, which apparently has been lost. But we have Lady Windermere's Fan, written by Oscar Wilde. And a lot of his fans out there will say that it's his first really good movie. For me, Ernst Lubitsch is one of those directors where you can almost kind of like feel him waiting for the arrival of sound so that he can really show off what he can do, because he's one of those guys that really took advantage of the sound era and just gave us some of those sparkling dialogue and some of the most delightful sexual comedies ever made, movies like Trouble in Paradise. But if you're interested in the early days of Ernst Lubitsch, Lady Windermere's Fan is worth a look. And speaking of movies by directors who would bloom in the talkie era, we have Sir Alfred Hitchcock's earliest feature film, The Pleasure Garden. And I saw it years ago when I was preparing to do a top 10 video for Alfred Hitchcock's entire career, and I watched every single movie that he'd ever directed. I have not one single memory of The Pleasure Garden. I can't remember a single shot. I can't remember anything about the story. His silent movie, The Lodger, is actually really, really good. And so if you're looking for like a good early Hitchcock movie that feels like Hitchcock, watch The Lodger. But if you want to know where he started, watch The Pleasure Garden. But I cannot tell you if it's good or bad because I'm a blank slate. But the next one's for all you football fans out there, in particular if you're a football fan who also enjoys comedy. But we have The Freshman, starring Harold Lloyd, who was one of the biggest stars of this period. And this is one of the biggest hits of 1925. I saw this years ago when getting prepared for a podcast about movies about football. It's very enjoyable. I'm not the world's biggest fan of football, but if you love football, who knows? The Freshman might end up being your favorite movie from 1925. But next up, we have a movie that was heavily censored at the time of its release, and as a result, there are a variety of different cuts out there, and there have been a lot of efforts over the last couple of decades trying to reassemble the official version of this movie. But we have The Joyless Street from director G.W. Papst, an Austrian director who would later do movies like Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl. But the reason The Joyless Street is worth a look is that it's one of the earliest performances by Greta Garbo, and this is right before she was recruited to go to Hollywood and become one of the most famous movie stars of her era. Now we're starting to get into some of the honorable mentions that could have just as easily been on the top 10 list, but I just ran out of room. There are too many movies that came out this year for me to include all the good ones in the top 10, but we have The Lost World, which is one of the top 10 movies of that year in terms of box office, adapted from the story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, directed by Harry O. Hoyt, and written by Marion Fairfax. But the reason this movie is famous 100 years later is because it features pioneering stop-motion special effects and animation by Willis O'Brien, who would later work on a little-known movie called King Kong in 1933. But basically, this movie is one of the first big massive hits featuring dinosaurs. So if you've ever enjoyed a Jurassic Park movie at any point in your life, all credit goes back to The Lost World, which features like brontosauruses on the loose in the city and things like that. And strangely enough, this is one of the first movies ever to be shown on airplanes. And keep in mind, it wasn't like a little screen in the back of the seat. They were projecting it on film in the airplane, which is kind of dangerous because film is incredibly flammable. It's a very volatile medium, so I don't know who thought that was a good idea. In any case, The Lost World does have that dubious distinction. But if you'll recall at the beginning of the video, I mentioned how this was a period where a lot of the initial pioneers were aging out while a new generation was kind of pushing them aside. Now it included the older generation, D.W. Griffith, who obviously is very controversial to the present day due to his film Birth of a Nation. But you must see his films Intolerance as well as Broken Blossoms. But Sally the Sawdust was a good late career hit for him, which starred W.C. Fields. It's got a lot of great juggling scenes and weird shell games. And toward the end of the movie, you see a lot of the cross-cutting that D.W. Griffith was famous for. But I'm a much bigger fan of some of the later movies starring W.C. Fields, movies like David Copperfield or The Bank Dick. But if you're obsessed with either W.C. Fields or D.W. Griffith, sooner or later you need to take Sally the Sawdust for a spin. And as long as we're on the subject of filmmakers whose careers were about to crash and burn, we might as well talk about the legendary Erich von Stroheim. And in 1925, he had a movie called The Merry Widow. I prefer the Ernst Lubitsch version from 1934, which is one of those kind of scandalous musical comedies of the period. It's very sexual, but it's all based on this 1905 operetta of the same name by Franz Lehár, if I'm saying that at all correctly. But just to give you the idea of what a maniacal, egotistical psychopath Erich von Stroheim was at this time, the movie is described as being personally directed by Erich von Stroheim during the title sequence. But Erich von Stroheim might be the official poster child for the director who went the most crazy in the 1920s after enjoying a little bit of success, because he had some early success with movies like Foolish Wives, and then his budgets and his ambition all just started spiraling out of control. Greed famously was originally delivered for like a 12-hour cut, and then it got truncated and destroyed and reduced down to like 2 hours. And after the making of The Merry Widow, MGM informed Erich von Stroheim that it would no longer be working with him due to all the sexually explicit scenes that he'd added into the movie. But who knows, maybe he was right, because this was a rare hit for Erich von Stroheim, but it has all sorts of weird kinky shit in there, like a lot of guys like gazing at close-ups of women's feet, or musicians who've been blindfolded so they can supply music while people screw in bed right beside them. But of all the filmmakers at this time who were trying to capture that kind of wild energy of the jazz age, that complete and total debauchery, Erich von Stroheim definitely filmed the best party sequences, like in this, as well as in The Wedding March, as well as in Queen Kelly. But he was also a great artist, and that's why people are still watching his movies 100 years later and still enjoying his acting performances in movies like The Grand Illusion or Sunset Boulevard. And I'll include a link down in the description below to my 75th anniversary review for Sunset Boulevard, where I go into quite a bit of detail about his performance in that movie, where he's absolutely extraordinary. But there's a famous anecdote where Billy Wilder was telling Erich von Stroheim, you know, your problem is that you were always 10 years ahead of your time. And Erich von Stroheim said, 20.
Then I said, you know, your problem always was, Eric, was you were always 10 years ahead of your time. And he looks at me and he says, 20.
In any case, I love and adore Eric von Stroheim. I have no trouble understanding why his career kind of flew off the rails and self-destructed. But if you want to get a taste of the mad genius of this time, I can think of no better director to study than Eric von Stroheim. But another movie which came very close to making my top 10 is Body and Soul, directed by Oscar Micheaux, starring Paul Robeson. And Oscar Micheaux was incredibly successful this time. He produced more than 40 movies. He ran Lincoln Motion Picture Company, which was the first motion picture company owned and controlled by black filmmakers. But this movie still has a ton of intensity and a ton of raw emotional power all these years later. But you gotta see it just to see the title cards, where the most outrageous dialogue or title cards ever written by human beings ever were for this movie. But let me put it this way. If you're at all sensitive to filmmakers dropping the N-bomb in their movies, movies like Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee, Body and Soul will take you right up to the breaking point. But this movie, the original version and the uncut version of this movie was so scandalous and so provocative that sadly it no longer exists anymore, because when it applied for an exhibition license from the Motion Picture Commission of the state of New York, it was denied approval on the grounds that it would tend to incite to crime and was immoral and sacrilegious. So Oscar Micheaux was forced to re-edit the movie. All we have now is the re-edited version, but if anybody out there knows how to get their hands on the original Body and Soul, let me know. But yet another movie which deserves a spot on my top 10 list is the Western Tumbleweeds, starring William Hart. It was actually his last Western, and the version I saw includes an intro that was added in 1939, where he basically looks back on his love of making motion pictures. But for Western enthusiasts, a lot of people will say that William S. Hart was basically John Wayne before there was John Wayne, but I think the more accurate way to describe him would be he was the Randolph Scott before Randolph Scott, because Randolph Scott was known for being very gallant and very chivalrous, almost like a knight in shining armor surrounded by a bunch of outlaws and bad men and that sort of thing. But if you watch some of Randolph Scott's movies like The Tall T, you can easily see the parallels between that persona and the persona of William Hart in Tumbleweeds, because he's just one of those guys who believes in honesty and integrity and in fair play. And also, if you're a diehard Western historian like my friend David Lambert, he pointed out how the following year there was a movie called Three Bad Men, directed by John Ford, which is incredible. But this movie, Tumbleweeds, features yet another land rush scene like in Three Bad Men, where you've got like people on unicycles, but it's just complete and total bedlam and insanity. But you don't get Three Bad Men in 1926 unless you get Tumbleweeds first in 1925. At any rate, I really wanted to include Tumbleweeds in my official top 10, but as you'll see when we get to the official list, there simply wasn't room. It's a very overstuffed, overcrowded year, because we have guys like Lon Chaney making multiple movies in the same year, only one of which managed to make it to the top 10. But let's talk about his honorable mentions first. Let's talk about The Monster, which is an early prototype for kind of like the old dark house, haunted house scenarios. But The Monster was directed by Roland West, who would also direct The Bat in 1926 and The Bat Whispers in 1930. The only other movie by him I've seen is a movie called Alibi. But the film's tagline sets it up perfectly. A mystery thriller and a love adventure, the romance of a boy and a girl in a mansion of hidden motives. You'll guess, you'll gasp, you'll love it. A mansion of many doors, a house of strange shadows. What lies beyond the door? What does it mean? Who can solve it? You'll keep guessing until the very end. But basically with The Monster, what you have is a horror comedy where you have a house full of exotic traps trying to kill all the characters. But another Lon Chaney movie which wounded me not to include in the top 10 list is The Unholy 3, directed by Todd Browning, where just the premise, you're like, oh my god, this is going to be the most fucked up movie I've ever seen. You basically have a sideshow ventriloquist, a midget, and a strongman from a circus forming this conspiracy known as the Unholy 3, and they embark upon a series of robberies. But right away you're like, oh my god, this is definitely going to be one of those really disturbing, fucked up horror movies that could only be made in the 1920s. Although you could say that Todd Browning, his brand of horror only intensified in the years to come with movies like West of Zanzibar, obviously Freaks in the early 1930s, which was one of the most disturbing movies ever made. And for people who are paying attention, you'll definitely recognize Harry Earls, who would star in Freaks a few years later. And one of the most fucked up parts of this movie is how oftentimes in their jobs, he'll pretend to be a baby due to his diminutive stature. In any case, this movie takes you to very strange, unusual places. Todd Browning was one of the real masters of thrillers and horror in the 1920s and 1930s, and he's most famous for his adaptation of Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. But getting back to the Unholy 3, there's all kinds of fucked up shit in this movie. Like on one of their robberies where they end up killing their victim while simultaneously crippling a toddler who is there at the house. But perhaps what I remember it for most is all the unusual shadow play in the movie. I feel like if you like shadows in movies, the late 20s and early 30s was just the absolute mother lode. But speaking of the mother lode, think it's time to get into the official top 10 because I've been talking, or at least I've been recording for quite a while at this point. We haven't even gotten to the fucking list. So let's talk about my number 10, The Phantom of the Opera, which is a story. As long as there are people out there who enjoy stories featuring horror and romance, they will find new ways to adapt The Phantom of the Opera. But for me, it's one of my earliest horror memories. When I was like a little kid, like in kindergarten or first grade in my school library, there was this one book devoted to horror movies, and it tackled movies from the late 20s and early 30s, which is probably part of why I'm so fascinated by that period. But I remember I would take that book and I would kind of hide it in different parts of the library, so I'd always know where to find it. I mean, you would think, oh, just leave it where it's supposed to be, and you'll be able to find it. But I was like 6 years old, wasn't thinking too clearly. But I remember flipping through that book and getting to Lon Chaney and The Phantom of the Opera and just being like, whoa, just being absolutely petrified. And both the performance as well as the makeup that he employed in the movie are still pretty ghoulish 100 years later. But I think the first official version of The Phantom of the Opera that I ever saw in full was the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, which I saw, I think, like in 8th grade on Broadway, and that totally blew my mind. But the origins for this particular version of the story, apparently back in 1922, Carl Laemmle, who was the president of Universal at the time, he took a vacation to Paris, and this author, Gaston Leroux, handed him a copy of the book, which had been published in 1910. And according to legend, Carl Laemmle read the book in one sitting, immediately bought the rights as a vehicle for actor Lon Chaney, and they went to work. And much like today, Universal had to go to great lengths to keep behind-the-scenes photos a secret. They didn't want anybody to see Lon Chaney in the makeup before the big reveal in the movie. And it's one of the biggest jump scares in the history of movies. And in yet another legend related to this movie, the cameraman Charles Van Enger claims that he was invited to the dressing room of Lon Chaney without knowing why. And when he got there, he could just see the back of the actor who was standing about a foot from him. And Lon Chaney whirled toward him with all the makeup on. And the cameraman said that he almost wet his pants then and there. So they all knew that they had a real winner on their hands. But for people wondering how Lon Chaney got so good at the art of pantomime and the art of basically telling stories with his expressions and his hands, apparently he was the son of deaf mutes. And so as a young child, in order to communicate with his parents, he learned to be incredibly expressive with his face and his hands, which obviously led to a legendary film career. Sadly, this extraordinary career for the Man of a Thousand Faces would be cut short only a few years later at the age of 47. He had all these complications related to throat cancer, and apparently while he was shooting one film, he got fake snow lodged in his throat, which caused an infection, and that infection led to pneumonia. But the official cause of death was throat hemorrhage from lung cancer. It sounds just absolutely awful and painful and just as horrifying as anything in any of his movies, but the career of Lon Chaney will live. Basically, as long as people continue to watch movies and horror movies and that sort of thing, they will always continue to rediscover the extraordinary achievements of the Man of a Thousand Faces. Now for my number 9, we're going to dive into the world of Japanese cinema with a movie that I just saw for the first time, Orochi, which apparently translates roughly to serpent, but the original name of this movie was Outlaw, but Japanese censors and police banned it because at that time it was against the law to depict an outlaw in a heroic fashion. But there's some old movies out there that I watch out of historical curiosity, almost like I'm some movie-loving archaeologist, but others I just get into, and this is one of the latter, where the movie is very entertaining, but also really dark and really tragic. But its total running time blasts by in the blink of an eye, and it has all these incredible themes of honor and integrity, basically a lone warrior versus a corrupt society. And that lone warrior is played by Sumasaburo Bando, if I'm saying his name correctly, but apparently he was a massive star at this time, and the movie was directed by Buntaro Furugawa. But this is a key early chanbara, which basically stands for Japanese sword fighting film, which is a very easy way to describe this movie because basically the last half of the movie is just one long big fight scene. But what's unusual about Japanese silent movies versus other silent movies from this period is they had this tradition of what was called live benshi narration, where they would show the movie in a theater, but there'd be a person in the theater describing the plot and kind of adding to the drama. And so they didn't use as many title cards because you had a person in the theater basically narrating the story as you go. And so when you watch it now, you're like, wait a second, do I really want to hear this person basically telling me the story while I watch? Especially since the voice now, you can tell it's been recorded much later, but you adjust to it very quickly. But if you're an enthusiast for silent movies, it will be a bit of a, an adjustment watching a silent movie in that fashion, but I strongly recommend you do so. Otherwise, you won't understand what the hell is going on in the story. But if you're a fan of later Japanese samurai movies from like the 1950s and 1960s, Orochi is definitely worth hunting down. But while we're on the subject of total badasses wielding swords, for my number 8, let's talk about Q Son of Zorro, starring Douglas Fairbanks Sr., the sequel to The Mark of Zorro from 1920. But in this movie, Douglas Fairbanks has to do the double duty of playing both Zorro, aka Don Diego, as well as his son, Don Cesar de Vega, who basically gets into a series of scrapes while studying abroad over in Spain, meaning that he has to turn into a whip-wielding outlaw, much like how his father was in the first movie, but ultimately it leads to a father-son team-up at the end of the movie that's absolutely glorious. But Douglas Fairbanks was one of the biggest badasses of his era. He did a ton of his own stunts, and he loved making swashbuckling adventure movies. Basically, any kind of adventure movie you could ever imagine, whether he's playing a masked vigilante or a pirate or whatever the case might be. But he was one of the founding members of United Artists alongside D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Charlie Chaplin. And I've probably seen more movies with his son, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who was in like Little Caesar and Gunga Din and all sorts of incredible movies. But for everybody out there who's ever loved any superhero movies in any era, I feel like every superhero movie ever made owes at least a small debt of gratitude to the character of Zorro, who was a masked vigilante long before there was even a thing known as superheroes, both on the page as well as on the screen. And this movie, let's just say if you like watching tricks and stunts, Douglas Fairbanks has got you covered. Whether it's like tricks with cigarettes or tricks with whips or tricks with guns, he loves showing off. I feel like if Douglas Fairbanks was known for anything, it's just showing off in movies and getting paid for it. And so if you want to understand why he was such a big deal back in the day, Q Son of Zorro will definitely get the job done. But from a number 7, let's get into the number 1 hit of 1925, The Big Parade, a World War I epic directed by King Vidor, starring John Gilbert. And John Gilbert starred in several movies in 1925. He's a massive actor. But King Vidor is one of those directors where I feel like every once in a while I'll watch one of his movies and I'm like, God damn, I should watch more movies by King Vidor. But he had a huge career, and I've only seen a handful of his films. I've seen The Crowd. I'm just scrolling through his movies real quick. I've seen The Northwest Passage. I've seen Duel in the Sun. And I saw his excellent adaptation of the novel The Fountainhead. And I've seen Stella Dallas, not to be confused with the 1925 version directed by Henry King. So I've seen some of his work, but he famously was one of those directors where he would make one for the studio, one for himself, and so his career's almost got like a bit of like a yo-yo effect where you're constantly wondering, is he making a hit for the studios or is he making a deeply personal movie? But I feel like The Big Parade is one of those movies that kind of qualifies as both. But because this movie was such a massive hit, it got re-released several times, and it also got re-released as the business was transitioning into the sound era, which led to competing versions of the movie, which opens the door to the question, what is the best version of the movie to watch? And there are people out there who have had much more complex debates over this than I have. The version that I saw had the new score composed by Carl Davis, because a lot of people were talking about how the Carl Davis score was the best score, but I wanted to see the silent version, but with the best score. And the version that I saw was available on Amazon, and it was absolutely in perfect, pristine condition. If you want to see a true silent film epic about World War I in pristine condition with no scratches or flaws or blemishes, that is the version that I would steer people toward. But if I were to try to condense the plot into a simple pitch, this is basically a story about a young man going over to fight in World War I and finding love and romance amidst all the horrors and atrocities of trench warfare. And there's some pretty bone-chilling sequences. Like at one point, a bunch of American soldiers are patrolling through the woods and they're getting taken out one at a time by a sniper. And to my knowledge, the only other World War I movie that I've seen from this period would be All Quiet on the Western Front, which came out a few years later. So if you want to see a World War I movie, like when the memories of that war were still relatively fresh, well, this movie will absolutely get it done. But yeah, I get why this movie was the number 1 hit. It's a big, bold, badass, sweeping, emotional journey. I just don't like it quite as much as some of the other movies on this list. Like my number 6, Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. Now, these days in 2025, the most famous version of Ben-Hur is most likely the version starring Charlton Heston that came out, I think, in the late 50s, but it was directed by William Wyler. But this version It was directed by Fred Niblo, a director that I was totally unfamiliar with, and written by June Mathis, based on the 1880 novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ by General Lew Wallace. The movie stars Roman Navarro and is the first feature-length adaptation of the novel and second overall following the 1907 silent short film. The original book was a monster bestseller, and it led to a very successful play which ran for 25 years. And so clearly it was safe to assume that there would be a built-in audience for this movie. However, the costs on this film ballooned. It was the most expensive movie ever made of the silent era up to that time, with the film's budget eventually reaching the heights of $3,900,000, which was quite a bit of money back in 1925 when MGM's average cost for a movie was about $158,000. So yeah, $3,900,000 was considerably more. And I'm seeing here that William Wyler's version was from 1959, but coincidentally, he was also one of the assistant directors on the 1925 version, so clearly he was taking notes. But I know that biblical epics can be a very tough sell for people sometimes. However, I would argue that the reason to watch the original Ben-Hur from 1925 is the same reason to watch the 1959 version starring Charlton Heston, due to two sequences. There is a battle at sea that must be seen to be believed, and there's a chariot sequence which also must be seen to be believed. If you want to see an example of Hollywood excess and Hollywood decadence, movies run amok 100 years ago, you have to see this movie, because the ramming sequence, first and foremost, is pretty goddamn depraved and over the top, where you've got nude people being tortured and another person being strapped to the front of the boat as it rams into another. It's just completely and totally insane. It's just carnage on an epic scale. But for the chariot sequence, I'm seeing here that a total of 200,000 feet of film was shot for the chariot race sequence, which had to be cut down to 750 feet by editor Lloyd Nosler. So yeah, basically 199,250 feet of film was left on the cutting room floor. But for a lot of film historians, this chariot sequence is as exhilarating as anything you'll see in a movie like Battleship Potemkin, which we'll be getting to in a few movies. But for me in 2025, looking back on this chariot sequence in 1925, I just can't help but be humbled by the scope and the ambition and the imagination and the danger of the stunts that are being performed, of the action on display. It is just an absolutely staggering sequence in film history. So when you want to talk about what's been lost in 2025 versus 1925, I would just say these classic movies with a cast of thousands, with stunts that are insanely dangerous, that is what has been lost in contemporary film culture and makes Ben-Hur absolutely required viewing 100 years later. But now let's get into my top 5 with easily my favorite fresh discovery that I made getting prepared for this video, because we have an Italian horror film called Maciste in Hell, aka Maciste all'Inferno, directed by Guido Brignone. But most important of all, it stars Bartolomeo Pagano, who first played this character of Maciste in the original Italian silent film epic Cabiria in 1914. Cabiria is one of the first epic films which kind of made American filmmakers in Hollywood aware of the fact, oh, you can actually try to do like big, giant 3-hour stories. But this actor, Bartolomeo, he played this same character 20 times between 1914 and 1926. And apparently Federico Fellini was a massive fan of this movie. But when people think about Italian horror now, they think about like Lucio Fulci films, or they think about Dario Argento films, but Maciste in Hell, I can safely say, it is unlike anything that you have ever seen. And the simple premise, as written over on IMDb, is the devil takes Maciste down to hell in an attempt to corrupt and ruin his morality. And suffice to say that in Italian cinema, anytime a demon or a devil is trying to destroy your sense of ethics, morality, chances are you're going to be surrounded by a bunch of scantily clad beautiful women, and at a certain point, they just completely, totally convert Maciste into being a demon in his own right, where he proceeds to basically starts taking over hell altogether. He's basically hell on wheels in battle, and we have all these great scenes of him like riding around on dragonback with beautiful women, or going into battle and punching demons' heads off and that sort of thing. But the trick photography and the claymation and the stop motion photography in this film is just absolute chocolate for the eyes. But this is one of those movies where I can safely say it is basically perfectly in line with my taste, almost like it was engineered in a lab to 100 years later lure me in and help me fall in love with it for the first time, because we have lots of fantasy, lots of horror, and lots of erotica all stirred together into this incredibly concentrated brew. And just to go big picture for a moment, if you consider yourself a film historian or a film connoisseur or a cinemaniac or however you wish to describe yourself, for me, the most important way to sustain that and maintain that passion and that enthusiasm over the long term, you have to continue to make fresh discoveries. If you don't make fresh discoveries, at a certain point, you're like, oh, well, I love those movies, but I've seen them 5 times, 10 times, so I really need to go back and think about them, talk about them, like expose them to people, blah, blah, blah. But for purely selfish purposes, you got to continue every once in a while to make fresh discoveries, which kind of rattle your cage and remind you, holy shit, movies are fucking cool as shit when done the right way. And I feel like for me, Maciste in Hell was probably the most important fresh discovery for me that I made in 2025, looking back at the great movies of the past, because every once in a while, if you don't have a movie that kind of comes along and blindsides you and surprises you, well, then movies will get a little bit predictable and a little bit boring, and it's easy to move on to other frontiers. So thank you to everybody who made this movie 100 years ago. You made me a very happy film fan in 2025. Now for my number 4, we have a movie where it was a foregone conclusion that it would be in this list. The big question was, where would it be in this list? Because I studied this movie in my History of Film Part 1 class back in 1998, and that was my introduction to the legendary Sergei Eisenstein. So we have Battleship Potemkin, but Eisenstein had 2 movies in 1925. He had Strike, and he had Battleship Potemkin. But back then, let's just say there was very little room to operate for a filmmaker back then, unless they were making propaganda for the government. But you had filmmakers like Alexander Dovzhenko, and you had Dziga Vertov, you had Podovkin, but you had a lot of big directors in the 1920s. But Eisenstein is probably the most famous because of Battleship Potemkin, because every couple of years a movie will come along which will like basically try to capture the best sequences from Potemkin and either satirize them or pay homage to them, because obviously in Brian De Palma's The Untouchables, we have an homage to the Odessa Steppe sequence from Battleship Potemkin. But even in Naked Gun 33 1/3, we have yet another loving homage to Battleship Potemkin. But the short version of the story is that this is a dramatization of the mutiny that occurred in 1905 when the crew of the Russian battleship Potemkin rebelled against their officers. And the reasons are many, like, whether it's like, rotten, stinking meat covered in maggots or whatever the case might be, or as we see in the Odessa Steppe sequence, all these women and children being mowed down by soldiers. Is pretty horrific stuff. But what makes this movie remarkable is Eisenstein's editing style. And I feel like if you want to be a great editor, you could do a lot worse than by studying the films of Sergei Eisenstein. And for me, my favorite movie by him is Alexander Nevsky, but Ivan the Terrible is also worth watching as well. But if you just want to study the art of montage and shot selection and shot composition and how to create dizzying effects with your images and your editing, Battleship Potemkin is one of those movies that is just as fresh and dazzling today as the first day it was released back in 1925. All right, so we finally arrived at my top 3, and I hope I've got enough energy to bring this video in for a safe landing, because I don't know how long this video is going to be, but just to give you a little peek behind the curtain, I've been recording for 3 hours at this point due to a lot of false starts, and anyway, just a lot of craziness on my end, but I'm doing the best that I can to stay focused. But luckily, we have some comedies to discuss, because the legendary Buster Keaton is on deck with 2 movies in 1925. He made Go West, which is good. But 7 Chances is astonishing. This was a play of the same name produced in 1916 by David Belasco. But this is a movie with a very simple premise that has been reused many times since. You have a young bachelor who's about to turn 27 years old, and he learns that he's going to inherit $7 million. Once again, this is 1925, but he's going to inherit $7 million, but he has to be married by 7 o'clock that evening or he won't get a penny. And so he just starts roaming around looking for basically anybody that might possibly marry him. Hopefully it'll end up being the girl that he's absolutely madly in love with. But what's hilarious about this movie is how basically in the first half of the movie, he can't get any women to pay attention to him. But in the second half, once women learn that there's $7 million on the line, well, then he's got too many women willing to pay attention to him. And there's this great sequence where he's asleep in a church, and the church keeps filling up with all these brides-to-be or hopeful brides-to-be. And when he wakes up, they just basically start chasing him with bricks and rocks, and they're just going to beat him down and marry him by force, which leads to all these incredible chase sequences with some of the most jaw-dropping stunts of Buster Keaton's career. But I think sometimes his stunts, they're so good and they're so memorable, they kind of overshadow some of his other accomplishments as a filmmaker, because Buster Keaton, he wasn't just a performer, he directed a ton of movies. And he's got some really visually inventive stuff in this movie. Like at one point, he's trying to confess his love to a girl, and it's this great two-strip Technicolor sequence during the movie. But we get this brilliant series of dissolves across several seasons as he's trying to confess his love to a woman, and meanwhile, her little dog in all these shots keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's just a great example of Buster Keaton's visual storytelling at this time, where he's just trying to show how this character is never going to get up the courage to confess his love to the woman that he truly wants to marry. But the big question is, how does Seven Chances compare to Buster Keaton's best work? Because I always say that my two favorite movies by him are The General and Sherlock Jr. And I feel safe in saying that Sherlock Jr. and The General remain my favorite movies by Buster Keaton. But the good news is Buster Keaton was incredibly prolific throughout the 1920s, where quite literally he risked life and limb over and over and over again with a series of shorts and a series of feature films. As a stuntman and as a filmmaker and as a screen persona, there's never been before or since anyone quite like Buster Keaton. So if you're a fan of stunts and comedy and just kick-ass filmmaking, definitely make time in your busy schedule to see Seven Chances. Or if you saw it a long time ago and you haven't seen it in a long time like me, go back and revisit it and it'll blow your mind all over again. All right, for my number 2, it's time to talk about F.W. Murnau, a strong contender for my favorite director of the silent era. But here's the question: which of his 2 films released around this time qualifies for a list about 1925? Because the film that I want to have as my number 2, The Last Man, aka The Last Laugh, as it was released in the United States, and as it's described on this Blu-ray, it came out just before New Year's in Germany, but right after New Year's in the U.S. So yeah, I'm seeing here 1924, December 23rd in Germany, January 5th, 1925 in the U.S. But in the same year, later that year, he had Tartuffe. If we were talking about Tartuffe, it wouldn't be my number 2, but it would still be in the top 10 just because F.W. Murnau is that good. But if we're going by the U.S. release, yeah, The Last Man, it's a strong contender for the best movie released this year. It's a strong contender for the best movie released in the silent era in the 1920s. But F.W. Murnau, he made a lot of movies that are contenders, whether you're talking about Faust or Sunrise or Nosferatu. He was just that goddamn good. But right alongside F.W. Murnau, we also have to give credit to Karl Freund, who shot The Last Laugh as well as Tartuffe, and would later become one of the most famous European imports in Hollywood. But he would shoot Metropolis for Fritz Lang. He would shoot Dracula. He would become a director and make movies like The Mummy and Mad Love. So anytime you get a great director and a great DP working together, well, then you get a movie like The Last Laugh, aka The Last Man. And what this movie is most famous for, it's the attempt to remove all title cards from the movie and tell it completely and totally visually. And the story's pretty straightforward and pretty simple, where you have a doorman played by Emil Jannings, who basically he takes a lot of pride in his work because where he's from, the fact that he wears a uniform and is gainfully employed gives him stature in his community. But he's told that due to his age and his size and getting older and weaker, that he's going to be asked to step down from his post and basically accept what he regards as a pretty humiliating demotion. And as soon as he loses his job, he realizes, well, who is he in the absence of being gainfully employed? But in spite of that relatively simple premise, this is a strong contender for the most visually inventive movie of this entire decade. It's one of those rare movies where it's not hyperbolic to say that it completely changed what was possible to do with the art form of cinema, what was possible with the movie camera, because the movie camera had never been more free, never been more loose, never been more creative and innovative. But what's interesting is how F.W. Murnau gave a lot of credit for this unusual approach to screenwriter Carl Mayer, who also wrote Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and would eventually write Sunrise for F.W. Murnau a few years later. But he described Carl Mayer as somebody who worked in, quote, the true domain of the cinema, and then he summarized their approach as such. All our efforts must be directed toward abstracting everything that isn't the true domain of the cinema, everything that is trivial and acquired from other sources, all the tricks, devices, and cliches inherited from the stage and from books. But this is one of those movies where you see what is possible when you have total control over a great soundstage with a lot of superb technicians, whether you're strapping a camera to the chest of somebody as they ride on a bicycle into an elevator, or doing a crazy extreme zoom shot into the ear of a gossiping woman across the alley, or the character played by Emil Jannings imagining a building coming down to crush him, almost like a scene that you would see in Inception like 90 years later, courtesy of Christopher Nolan. But if you want to know what screen acting was all about in the silent era, this is Emil Jannings at his most intense, and it's right up there with some of his best work that he would later do for director Joseph von Sternberg when they made the silent movie The Last Command, as well as the talkie movie The Blue Angel. But whether you're already an existing fan of the movie or about to watch it for the first time, I strongly recommend this Blu-ray, which has a ton of incredible supplementary features on there. But when people ask you, like, how come you're talking about movies from 100 years ago? Like, what can we possibly learn from the from these filmmakers who've been dead and gone for many, many decades? What could possibly be learned by watching all these dusty old movies? Well, my answer will always be, have you seen The Last Laugh, aka The Last Man by F.W. Murnau? Because when it comes to pure raw cinema, and pure raw cinema for me is telling stories with pictures, this is one of those movies that not only has withstood the test of time, but just keeps getting better with each passing year. Just not quite as good as my number one movie on this list, The Gold Rush. As I said at the beginning of this video, if somebody were to take all the movies released in 2025 and put them in one pile, and then put The Gold Rush in another pile and say, one of these is getting a match and they're going to go up in flames, choose one. I would preserve and protect The Gold Rush. This is one of those rare movies that has so much heart and soul and so much poetry that it's almost overwhelming to watch the movie, where you're going to feel chills and you'll have smiles and laughter and tears. But it is just poetry on celluloid. This is Charlie Chaplin at the absolute peak of his abilities. Although you could say The Kid and you could say City Lights, and there are a lot of strong contenders in his work. He made a lot of really good movies, but I feel like The Gold Rush is that movie where his entire career was leading up to this point. And even though I've seen this movie many times over the last 25, 30 years, every time I revisit the movie, the moment I hear that score kick in, the score composed by Charlie Chaplin, I hear a few notes and I start getting goosebumps up and down my arm. I start getting misty-eyed. It's completely, totally ridiculous. But as soon as you hear that score, like, oh, we are going back into this world, the world of the Gold Rush, unlike any other movie ever made. And for anybody out there who doesn't like watching really old movies because it feels like homework, it feels like an academic pursuit, The Gold Rush is one of those movies that completely implodes that, because you can just sit back and let this movie wash over you with just waves of pleasure. And it was one of the movies that got me into watching silent movies. Before I took that first silent film class back in college, I'd already seen The Gold Rush and I was like, oh my God. And the first version I saw was the version from like 40 or 41, or actually 1942, where Chaplin modified the original 1925 film, re-recorded a musical score and added narration. And for many, many years, that was actually the version that was seen the most because it was in really good condition, whereas the original 1925 cut, I mean, anytime you got a copy of the print, it was like, whoa, it was like really scratchy, really grainy. But thankfully, this Criterion Blu-ray includes a copy of the 1925 version of the film that has been lovingly preserved and restored, where you really get to see it with fresh eyes and appreciate it for the first time, if you have not done so already. And I was just completely floored by the movie all over again. And if somebody were to put a gun to my head and say, you get to pick one silent movie from any point between like 1895 and 1927 to try to convert people into being fans of silent movies, The Gold Rush all day. I've seen many good silent movies that are absolutely incredible to watch, and maybe you might argue that it's better to start with a short film where you'd have a better chance of converting them, like, you know, like a crazy short film like Convict 13 by Buster Keaton. It's just this action-packed, you know, this wild romp. But if you want to really like tug at the heartstrings and just like give people overwhelming emotion, there's nothing quite like The Gold Rush. Like, there's a scene where the tramp shows up at a party where everybody's like, you know, dancing and laughing and having a good time. And Chaplin gives us this shot from behind where quite literally Chaplin is acting with his back, if that even makes sense, where something about his posture and the way he's slumped over, you realize where, due to his poverty and the humble origins of that character, he's completely, totally isolated from his fellow human beings, which makes it all the more heartbreaking, but also all the more funny, where he thinks this beautiful woman played by Georgia Hale is waving to him and about to greet him, and as she walks up and he walks up to her, she just strolls right on by him and greets somebody else, leaving the tramp with this perplexed, kind of puzzled, heartbroken expression. So Chaplin is one of the true masters of making you cry and laugh and feel like in heartwarming emotion all at the same time. But also, this movie's just a wild, fucked up movie about cannibalism. I mean, some of the craziest shit I've ever seen is where you have this guy chasing Chaplin around because he thinks Chaplin has turned into a chicken. So it's like, if you like slasher movies where somebody's wielding an axe trying to kill their friends so they can eat them because they're starving after they, you know, finding gold out in the middle of nowhere, the Gold Rush will absolutely blow your mind on that front as well. So it's very macabre and very moving and very special. There's never been a movie quite like the Gold Rush, but I'm just going to keep coming back to this. The movie requires no intellectual pretension or no interest in film history to enjoy it purely as just pure raw entertainment. Whether you're 5 years old or 85 years old, whether you've seen all the great movies of the past or none of the great movies of the past, none of that matters. You can just sit down and watch the Gold Rush as a movie and just let it work its way through your body. It's just an incredible movie-going experience. And when people try to put their finger on what makes movies matter, what made movies the dominant art form of the 20th century, it's thanks to movies like the Gold Rush. It's up there with Casablanca and Citizen Kane and Lawrence of Arabia and The Godfather and any seminal movie that you care to mention. And if you're composing a Hall of Fame list, whether it's a top 10 or a top 100 of the best movies ever made from any country, from any era, I feel like the Gold Rush will always deserve a place on that list. And on that note, I'm going to wrap this video up. I don't know if I've ever recorded this long by myself. Obviously, I'm going to cut this down quite a bit once I start editing, but I've been recording for 3.5 hours at this point. It's been quite an endeavor, but I've loved every second of it. I hope some of it makes sense and doesn't just sound like me babbling, but this is quite a test of endurance, but I look forward to doing it again for 1926 next year. So I hope I brought some interesting movies to your attention. I hope some of you will try these movies out for the first time or be encouraged to go back and revisit some of the classics from the 1920s that you might already be in love with. But I look forward to reading people's comments down below. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everybody. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.